going to see many Conservatives like him voting for Brexit?
Well, we've got, sitting on the fence, Tim, is bad for your health. I remember asking you last year that why David Cameron isn't actually renegotiating fundamental free movement. You said it was silly. So we're hearing lots of these Conservatives now saying one thing at home and going into the European Parliament and saying a completely different thing altogether. He's not calling for free movement to be reformed and to end free movement and all rights of people who have been attracted by this migrant crisis that will get EU passports and come to the UK. He's not said anything about this, the 20 billion pounds we give to the EU every year, about stopping that. There is no change.
See,
it's just shadow boxing.
Do we think it's going to be in June? Both of you?
Sooner the better.
Sooner the better, I agree. But,
right.
Tim is wrong about some of the things he says. Passports, EU passports, Tim, do you know how long it takes to get a passport in Germany? 8 years? 10 years in Italy? How long does it take to get a passport here? 5 years. You really just don't know your facts. You just
that hasn't stopped the mass immigration, which again,
you just talk a lot of scaremongering.
We're going to talk about immigration in just a moment. Good. So you can hold your fire. Now, the EU is in the grip of a migrant crisis, and it's not about to go away. This week, the International Monetary Fund predicted that 1.3 million migrants could arrive in Europe every year. French Prime Minister Manuel Valls has warned that Europe's migration crisis poses a direct threat to the future of the EU. And there's evidence that Schengen, that's the EU's passport-free travel zone, of which the UK isn't a member, is already unravelling, as member states reintroduce border controls to try to stem the flow of people fleeing conflict zones in the Middle East and elsewhere. In August last year, Hungary built a fence along the border with non-Schengen country Serbia, blocking a railway line used as a key crossing point. In September, Austrian authorities imposed border controls at the main crossings from Hungary. Later that month, the German government imposed border checks with Austria. The next day, Slovakia placed 220 police officers along its borders with Hungary and Austria. And the Netherlands temporarily reinstated border controls with Germany. In October, Hungary built a razor-wire fence along the border with Slovenia. And at the beginning of the year, Sweden introduced checks on the Öresund Bridge, which links the country with Denmark, while Denmark imposed border controls with Germany. Well, we're joined now by the Labour MEP Claude Moraes. He's chair of the European Parliament's Justice and Home Affairs Committee. And, of course, my other guests are still here. Claude Moraes, Schengen's dead, isn't it?
It's in deep trouble. And Manuel Valls was absolutely right to say that this is an existential crisis and it's a deep crisis. The problem with what he's saying, though, is he's a Prime Minister from a big country, and it's only the big countries that have the assets to do something about it. When he says it's the EU has limited assets to do anything, institutions that is, Frontex, the Asylum Support Office. I mean, these are minimal assets. Frontex is not some sort of big military agency. It's a bunch of civilians doing a job on minimal budgets. It's the big countries that can do something. Now, whatever your view on the migration crisis, whether you think Germany was a pull factor, whether you're generous about the migration crisis, in the end, to deal with this, to have a tough external border, for example, the border agency, to have relocation, whatever your view, it is the countries like France, the big countries, who will have to do something now to create integrity on our external border and to create an organised and compassionate response.
Yes.
There's no other way out of this. I mean, even if Germany had not done what it had done, we would have had a global crisis.
Would it, though, have been on this sort of scale? I suppose we'll never know, will we?
Let me tell you one reason why. 85% of refugees now in Turkey are living outside camps. Even if Turkey was helping us now, they would not be able to control the situation fully.
Would, then, Timothy, quotas have been a more efficient way of working through this migration crisis? Let's, for argument's sake, say we would still have had large numbers of people coming from the Middle East and parts of North Africa. Quotas would have meant there would have been a regulated system, that each country in the EU would have taken a proportionate number of migrants, and then both the Dublin Agreement, which is where asylum seekers or refugees have to actually claim asylum in the country they arrive at, and Schengen would have continued to function.
No, the key point, of course, is the renegotiation of Dublin, of the agreement, but maintaining the basic principles that we seem to have lost. I mean, I don't know whether Claude agrees with Yvette Cooper's remarks that Schengen should be dismantled. I don't know, but all I'm saying is I don't think so. I think the key thing is to get the nuts and bolts right. The nuts and bolts and the principles applying to people who arrive at the external borders of the European Union. We're not part of Schengen, of course, but the external borders are important to us. They have to be processed.
Can Greece and Italy cope with those numbers as the smaller country?
No, they will need more resources, and that is part of what we would propose. They need their help. But once they have that help, there should be no question about maintaining that principle that the first safe country that people arrive at has to be the country that processes applications. Right. Otherwise, it becomes chaotic, and that is what has been going on, I'm afraid, with a lack of resolve by some countries.
Do you agree with that principle, that actually the Dublin Convention agreement should stay put and should be reinforced?
Oh, you should claim asylum in the first safe place you get to. If your house is on fire, you don't go looking down the street, you go to the first house to call for the emergency services.
But is that really practical when you look at Greece and people arriving in the numbers they have been on the coast?
But the countries that are getting this influx is because the German Chancellor said, come on, come on. If one country's got responsibility for this, that these countries should be getting a cheque from, Germany should pay up.
She was. I mean, do you agree with Yvette Cooper that actually Schengen should be dismantled?
I mean, that's her view. If you dismantle it, you need to have something in its place. And actually, there's broad agreement here about Dublin, because the Commission are now consulting about, say, scrapping Dublin and replacing it with Dublin 4. I mean, there's broad agreement here because it's natural to claim in the first country that you arrive in. And if you take that away, you need to replace it with something pretty sensible. At the moment, Commission are not coming up with that. On Schengen, what Yvette Cooper is saying, of course, it's now de facto dying, but these freedoms are at the heart of Europe. They matter, and there's no point in her saying it's dead without saying what we
Well, that brings it on. Without
Schengen,
is that the end of the beginning of the end of the EU, which is what Manuel Valls said?
No. I mean, I disagree entirely about that.
So.
That's what Tim wants. I don't want that, because I think Schengen is valuable economically.
But hang on. The point about Schengen is it's always had within it the ability to reintroduce borders when there's been a pressure or emergency situation. And that's what some of these countries, not all, but some are doing. The key point, again, we come back to it, the nuts and bolts of Dublin. We're all feeding in our ideas for the new Dublin Agreement. That isn't coming until March, so I'm a bit surprised that so much speculation in the media and elsewhere about someone saying what Dublin is going to be. It isn't decided at all yet, and I'm convinced that that basic principle of people being dealt with at the first safe country will be maintained.
Right.
And that's the key to it all.
But Tim, even if Germany and Angela Merkel hadn't said, refugees, you are all welcome here, would we be in a totally different situation to the one we are in currently?
Well, there's been movements across different European states for border controls to be reinstated, but there is a borders crisis in the European Union. There's a crisis over free movement, and I'm still waiting to hear why David Cameron will not negotiate free movement. Why is he tinkering with benefits? You know, you called renegotiating free movement stupid. I want to know what David Cameron actually thinks and why he's not taking this opportunity to reinsert British borders.
Is a basic principle which assists us normally, in normal circumstances, through our trade and our exchange of services and skills. It is absolutely vital for British interests.
But should it be suspended? Should it be suspended at the moment while this migration crisis is going on? Because there'll be many people, Timothy, that will say, once these migrants are within Schengen, and I don't know how many years it takes for migrants or refugees to gain some sort of citizenship, then they are free to move anywhere else.
Joe, refugees do not have freedom of movement. Exactly. Please remember that. So all these refugees that UKIP are frightening us about, the scaremongering nonsense from UKIP.
Oh, you're calling Cologne scaremongering? You're calling Cologne scaremongering?
Hang on, that's not the same. That's not the same thing.
And your party. That's what I'm actually saying. They cannot have free movement now, the refugees. So that is not an issue, I think.
Do you think Manuel Valls has actually inflamed this situation with what he said, Claude Moraes, because inaccuracies about the status of refugees and migrants and who can actually then move, not only within Schengen but beyond, then starts to get into the media narrative?
He's in my party, and I'll say that, yes, he has. Why? Because there's no point in stating a problem and not saying what the solution is. On Monday, we have an Amsterdam GHA Council, and he should be sending ministers there to deal with the solution. Because, I mean, this was an example. Refugees at the moment have a certain status. They don't have immediate free movement. What the member states with the assets and the resources need to do with the problem that we currently have is get to work and sort out what we do about the relocation, the external border, because that's not going to go away. And the other issues, Dublin, Schengen, get some settlement on this, irrespective now of what we think about what Germany did or did not do, because we have a problem right now. So the big countries need to stop saying what the existential problem is. It's bleedingly obvious what it is, and start coming up with solutions.
We have to halt it there just for a moment. Now, you're going to stay with us, Claude Moraes. Relations between the EU and Poland, the sixth largest economy in the Union, have soured over controversial media and judicial reforms introduced by the new government in Warsaw. The Eurosceptic Law and Justice Party swept to power in elections last year. And this week, the Polish Prime Minister was called to Strasbourg to explain herself to MEPs at their monthly plenary meeting. Adam Fleming was there too.
What could possibly make you think Poland's new Prime Minister doesn't like the freedom of the media?
Prime Minister, would you like the EU? Would you like the EU to butt out, Prime Minister?
In Poland, there have been protests because the government's sacked loads of staff from the state broadcaster, and it's appointed a load of sympathetic new judges to the Constitutional Court. The European Commission's now investigating, using new powers to check that member states are upholding the rule of law.
Let me show you just how heated this whole issue has become. Look at the front cover of this Polish news magazine, which shows various senior figures from the EU, like the President of the Parliament, Martin Schulz, and Chancellor Merkel, dressed as Nazis.
In the Strasbourg chamber, Beata Szydło used history to make the case for her reforms.
To jest historia.
Poland's history has been a troubled history. Our fathers and grandfathers gave their blood for freedom, for us to be part of a united Europe. But they also spilt blood for the freedom of other European nations. For many decades we had to fight for the right to speak our own opinions, to fight for the right to build our own state. We achieved that, and we are not going to have that taken away.
Her main tormentor was the leader of the Liberal group, Guy Verhofstadt, who raised the spectre of Vladimir Putin.
The inconvenient truth here is that Mr. Putin doesn't like European unity. He wants, in fact, he has an obsession. He wants to destroy European unity, and what's happening in Poland, that could help him, Madam Prime Minister.
While the man from the Commission tried to sound calm. Tried to.
All members of the European Union have signed of their own free will and ratified by the national parliaments European treaties, thus entering into obligations as far as maintaining the rule of law is concerned.
But what about Law and Justice's parliamentary allies, the British Conservatives?
It's quite strange that they choose this particular issue. For example, when countries broke the Stability and Growth Pact, they didn't use this procedure. When countries like Greece do not play their role in defending the external borders of the Schengen under the agreements they signed, they don't come in. But suddenly you have a more Eurosceptic government and they decide to use this procedure.
For supporters of the Polish government outside, some who travelled by bus for 16 hours for this, it's a question of where power lies, with the EU institutions or with the individual member states.
Prime Minister, how did it go? Do you think you convinced them?
If the Commission rules the Polish Prime Minister is acting undemocratically, she faces the prospect of losing her right to vote at future summits. Oh, and she still wouldn't answer my questions, even the nice ones.
Prime Minister, did you have a good trip to Strasbourg?
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.